Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Sheldon Chambers and I will be your host. Today I am going to be joined by Sarah White, retired MSP, and Sandra White, retired MSP, who was first elected to the Holyrood in 1999. But first,
Thank you, Sheldon.
so good. First, we're going to do the Ukrainian update. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has submitted a proposal to Ukrainian Parliament to extend martial law and general mobilization for another 90 days. After Zelensky said he was considering a reset to replace several senior officials, Kyiv's mayor Vitaly Klitschko has criticised the possibility of firing the military commander-in-chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, saying it was due to his leadership that many Ukrainians truly trust the armed forces. Klitschko and Zelensky have traded criticisms during the war. Russia has admitted that one of its senior occupation officials, Alexei Potoshenko, was amongst those killed when a supposed bakery in Russian-held Lysychansk was bombed. The Kremlin had previously characterized the casualties as civilians. Russian state-run news agency RIA, Vosti, and TASS have now reported that Potoshenko was a former pro-Russian militiaman who at the time of his death was Minister of Emergency Situations in the self-proclaimed Russian-controlled Luhansk People's Republic. The Ukrainian regional public broadcaster Suspolny Donbass and the Kyiv Independent reported the bakery was set up after the Russian occupation of Lysychansk and supplied Russian proxy forces as well as providing a meeting place for Russian-backed officials. Russia launched an attack against the Ukrainian city of Kherson on Monday, killing at least 4 people and injuring one official said. Senate Republicans close to Donald Trump have distanced themselves from the bipartisan bill that would include wartime aid for Ukraine. Both Democratic and Republican negotiators in the upper house have unveiled their proposals for a $118 billion package of border enforcement and funding for Ukraine, Israel, and other US allies. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, has threatened that deal would be dead on arrival there. A senior official in Ukraine's intelligence agency has been fired after revelations that the investigative journalists were wiretapped, according to a source of the AFP news agency. Reporters Without Borders, RSF, had called on authorities to investigate several alleged instances of intimidation. Russian anti-war presidential candidate Boris Nadezhdin said a working group of Central Election Commission had invalidated 15% of supporters' signatures backing his election bid. That figure, if confirmed, exceeds the allowable error rate and would provide grounds to disqualify Nadezhdin from running against Vladimir Putin. The Commission has previously used the excuse of incorrect paperwork to disqualify candidates who might pose a threat to Putin. However remote, a final ruling is due on Wednesday, Nadezhdin said. Hi, Sandra. With so many important elections this year, how uncertain is Ukraine's future in this war?
I'm very concerned in regards to what you've just said, Sheldon. When you think, 2 years now, and people have been killed in this conflict, and now we're having, what would you say, not so much a regime change in Ukraine, obviously, but a change of leading figures. And I do worry, is this the proper way to go ahead? in regards to that. I worry that Zelensky may be losing it a bit in regards to his own command and is moving people around to suit whatever he is planning to do. Obviously, the European Commission last week has, basically said they will, support Ukraine throughout whatever with monies, and you've mentioned about the USA as well in regards to the billions of pounds they're giving also, but nothing seems to be moving in the right direction. And then we have Russia, basically, I don't think anyone is being allowed to challenge Putin, whether it is genuine about the paperwork and the votes and the legitimacy of it. I've yet to study it to see if that is correct or not. But I think it doesn't look good in that side, of the world, and also with the situation in Palestine and Gaza as well. So come elections, I think Putin and also Zelensky are shoring up their support. And if it's basically just talking about Ukraine and Russia and the war, which is still ongoing, I think election-wise, we need to look at that very, very carefully in the West and in the USA in regards to obviously funding which has been sent to Ukraine and the refugees that we're accepting from Ukraine into the rest of Europe and the UK as well. So I have a great concern in regards to how these elections will pan out, mostly for the safety of the Ukrainian, people who are suffering under this war. And I think it's something that we really need to look at in depth and get independent analysis as to what they think is going to happen. I simply, my own thoughts, I simply don't trust some of the information that's coming out from Ukraine, from the EU, and also from Russia as well. So I think it's a very, very worrying time for the world, never mind that part of the world, the regions there. Something I think an independent inquiry should be looking at just now to see exactly where we are going. Will we get the truth? I don't know. But it's a worrying time, and I'm concerned about any elections that come about in these two countries.
Thank you. We're going to now turn to Israel and Gaza. AP is reporting that Israel's evacuation orders in the Gaza Strip now cover 2/3 of the territory, or 246 square kilometers. UN humanitarian monitors today more than half of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people is now crammed into the town of Rafah on the border with Egypt and surrounding areas. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said a quarter of Gaza's residents are starving and 85% of the population has now been driven from their homes, with hundreds of thousands surviving in makeshift tent camps. The health ministry in Gaza said the known Palestinian death toll is at 27,478 people after nearly 4 months of war. About 8,000 displaced Palestinians have been evacuated from a besieged hospital in Gaza's southern city of Khan Yunis, where they had been sheltering, the Red Cross has said. An estimated 100 elderly, wounded and disabled patients, along with 100 staff and volunteers, remain at the Al-Amal Hospital, an International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society spokesman said. The hospital, run by the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, has been under siege for more than 2 weeks, surrounded by heavy shelling and fighting. At least 32 of the 136 remaining Israeli hostages captured by Hamas are dead, according to an internal assessment conducted by the Israeli military, reported in the New York Times. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Cairo to meet the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. It's a day after Blinken started his latest tour of the Middle East by meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Riyadh. Blinken and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman discussed regional coordination to achieve an enduring end to the crisis in Gaza, according to the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees expects its preliminary report into Israelis' claims that a dozen of its employees took part in the 7th of October attack on Israel to be ready by the early of next month. Dorothy Klaus told reporters in Lebanon that the agency expects donors who suspended their funding after the claims emerged to review their decisions based on the probe. The US and UK were among those who pulled funding from the agency after Israel's claims. The US military says it's carried out more strikes in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, hitting what is described as explosive uncrewed surface vehicles, or USVs, which Reuters says are explosive-laden drone boats. A UK ship travelling through the southern Red Sea has been attacked by a drone, but no one has claimed responsibility as yet. In its latest operational update, the Israeli military claims it has killed dozens of terrorists in the central and northern Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours. Palestinians' news agencies, Wafa, reports that Israeli bombardments continue in Khan Yunis, with large areas east of the city of Deir al-Balha also being targeted. At least 20 Palestinians were killed over the weekend in Israeli strikes on Rafah, the city previously designated a safe zone by the Israeli military and to where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had fled, according to the UN agency, humanitarian agency OCHA. Sandra, the biggest victims of this conflict so far have been children. What is the consequences of war on children's development, especially in Gaza right now?
I've been in Gaza and Khan Yunis and Rafah, and I have saw the children from after the Operation Cast Lead, which was in 2010, I believe. Can be corrected if I'm wrong. The children at that particular point were suffering terribly from limbs being lost. I think Gaza is the biggest place where they have artificial limbs. These were children. They were also so psychologically damaged when we visited a school. Kids who were drawing would draw bombs and planes and guns and bullets. That was in their mind. Psychologically, these children obviously are now adults, whether they're still alive, who knows. So you can imagine what the psychological damage is to these kids who have survived. Because let's remember, the population of Gaza has been decimated, and the biggest, population-wise is women and children. So any of these kids who do survive, many of them without limbs, you'll have seen the pictures of it. Many of them have seen whole families murdered. Many have seen dead bodies on the street. How can't they not be psychologically damaged? It will take years and years to repair this damage. And that's children. When you look at the damage which has been caused, which is against international law, because international law conflict shouldn't be, basically says you shouldn't target schools, hospitals, Red Crescent, safe zones, but they've all been targeted. And we know the whole thing, the whole reason for this is to completely cleanse Gaza, and it's happening in the West Bank already anyway, of any Palestinian people. It's a genocide. Israeli ministers have said it quite openly. They want rid of all of the Palestinians, and they should be sent to all parts of the world, basically. Mentioned Scotland could take in these refugees. It's always been the plan to completely cleanse Palestine and Gaza of Palestinians. Egypt is refusing to take any Palestinian refugees in. I mean, they've got the Rafah border crossing, but no one can get through. They're actually putting up more fencing there to stop anyone from getting through. And one thing I really can't understand is you've got young kids, you've seen the videos and the pictures of it. You've got young kids standing at these gates of Rafah where they're starving, they're ill, they've seen their loved ones murdered, basically, and yet on that other side of that wall there are aid trucks that can't get through, and you've got Egyptian soldiers. I mean, what does that say to these kids or the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank? That nobody cares. And I think that's the worst part of it all coming out of them, the people in Gaza. Why isn't anyone caring about us? What have we done to deserve this? And that will never go away. That will just fester and fester in these young children. So a ceasefire is the only thing which will stop that. But will the Palestinians be able to survive even if we get a ceasefire? There is nothing there. They've even put salt into the water supply, the salination supply, the sewage supply. All their culture has been destroyed. Even their burial grounds, the graveyards have been destroyed. You've seen pictures, there's nothing there. And that has a catastrophic effect, not just on the kids, but the rest of the population who are left. And the one thing that really, really pains me is the fact that this has been going on for 75 years, not just since October last year. 75 years, and it's the last 16 years, it's been a prison surrounded by walls and checkpoints, and kids can't even go to school. So they've already suffered terrible psychological damage. And, you know, I really take my hat off to UNRWA and the Red Crescent, and even closer to home, there's Jerry O'Hare, who works in Glasgow University, and medical staff there as well, who have been over there and done their best to try and stop this psychological damage, to try and treat it. And now we're on to this as well. It really, really is the world's shame that nobody is doing anything about it. I mean, you read out, Sheldon, about the
Sorry, I'm going to
IDF
have
saying
to
they
move on.
killed a dozen terrorists. They've killed 30,000 Palestinians. Okay, sorry, I know you've got to move on.
Yeah, I appreciate, sorry. We are now going to move to a story about a teenager trapped in Gaza who is bringing urgent legal challenge against the UK government. A teenager trapped in Gaza and separated from his parents has brought an urgent legal challenge against the UK Home Office and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office after the government refused entry clearance for him to join his family in the UK. The 18-year-old man, whose life is at imminent risk, has been internally displaced several times and has been homeless. He is now staying with extended family in Gaza in a home subject to heavy bombardment. His parents were visiting their two older sons in the UK on the 7th of October, one who arrived in the UK on a scholarship and now has a work visa, and the other one who is a British national astrophysicist who also arrived in the UK on a scholarship. Their younger 18-year-old son did not travel with them as he was starting his first year of university in Gaza. He is emotionally, financially, and practically dependent on his parents. This situation is extremely grave, his eldest brother said. It is a ticking time bomb. He could be killed at any point. The toll on my parents is indescribable. My mother has Parkinson's, the tremors have worsened now, and it is spreading to other parts of her body. Every day, the probability he will be killed gets higher and higher. The anxiety is literally killing my mother, while my brother is alone, desperate and abandoned. In December, the teenager made an urgent entry clearance application to the Home Office based on Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which relies on his rights to family life, but the Home Office refused, stating he had not submitted his biometrics at a visa application centre in Gaza or crossed the border to reach a VAC in Egypt. All VACs were were and remain closed in Gaza. The man's brother contacted FCDO directly to include him on the UK's excavation list, but they also refused to assist, arguing that he does not meet the criteria as he does not have the UK visa for 6 months or more, or a spouse or child under 18 living in the UK. On Wednesdays, the teenager's legal representatives will argue that he had made previous successful entry clearance applications to visit his brother in the UK alongside his parents and had provided biometrics as recently as August 2022. The Home Office has the power to exercise discretion to consider his application without biometrics. In Westminster today, SNP MP Peter Grant is led a debate on the support for civilians fleeing Gaza, calling on the UK government to allow British citizens to sponsor dependents fleeing the conflict. The MP for Glenrothes has previously raised the case of his constituent, Dr. Lubna Haddora, who has several close relatives displaced and trapped in Gaza, but has so far received no help from the UK government, arguing that they have no interest in supporting anyone who is not a UK national or passport holder. Commenting, Peter Grant MP said the UK government is not doing enough to support the Palestinian refugees who are fleeing Gaza. The very least they should be doing is setting up a scheme similar to that they offered the Ukrainian refugees. Sandra, what is the UK government's legal obligation to help families in Gaza reunite with families in the UK?
Well, as you have already said, the European courts, basically the Convention anyway of human rights, that's one of the areas where they can and should be helping. But unfortunately, I think the Home Office isn't fit for purpose, but also they really couldn't care less about what's happening in Gaza, to the people in Gaza. And to say about the biometrics and obviously the visa application area where he was supposed to report to, they were all closed. They were all closed after October the 7th. So even if they could manage to get there, which they couldn't because they were closed, so they could not, there's no way they could put anything in. He had, as you previously mentioned, Sheldon as well, he had already submitted the biometric evidence in 2022. So they've got that, they've got the discretion, they can do that, but the Home Office isn't fit for purpose. It's picking and choosing. Obviously, I mentioned Ukraine at the very beginning in regards to taking people in from Ukraine, and they can quite easily do that. But honestly, they're not interested in anyone that's coming from Gaza. They've already, taken the funding away from UNRWA. They're already, just dragging their heels, as is most of the world as well. So I, unfortunately, don't have much hope of the young man being able to get over here. And you congratulate Peter Grant and others who are pushing for this, but I have no faith in the Home Office for any of this to come to fruition. And I feel terribly sorry for the young man, but also for all the people who are trapped in Gaza. A ceasefire is the only way we'll ever get anything done in this area. And I would appeal, as Peter Grant and others have, for the Home Office to do that, to do something about this young man. But I fear that they won't.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to Westminster, where Kwasi Kwarteng has said he is going to stand down as MP at the next election. Kwasi Kwarteng, the former Chancellor who oversaw the ill-fated mini-budget under the short-lived government of Liz Truss, has said he will not stand again as an MP at the next election. The MP's announcement came as a reminder of the debacle hours before Truss was to launch a right-wing Conservative movement called Popcon. Joined by other senior figures from the party, Kwarteng, who represents Spelthorne in Surrey, said he has told his constituency association on Monday that he would not fight the election. He tweeted, "It has been an honour to serve the residents of Spelthorne since 2010, and I shall continue to do so for the remainder of my time in Parliament." He has been generally safe Conservative seat, returning a Labour MP only once in more than 100 years, and Kwarteng secured a majority of 18,393 at the last election. More than 80 sitting MPs have announced they will leave Parliament at the next election, more than the 74 who retired in 2019. Kwarteng joins dozens of other Tory MPs who have announced that they will not be contesting the election at the time when the current polls indicate the party faces a total wipeout. Truss and Kwarteng had once been close, but the MP, who was sacked in 2022 by her after only 38 days as Chancellor, has since made critical comments such as that she was not wired to be Prime Minister. As Chancellor, Kwarteng was accused of delivering a reckless mini-budget for the rich after his 45 billion tax-cutting package sent the pound crashing to its lowest levels against the dollar in 37 years. He has since declared thousands of pounds from media appearances and was due to start advising the Australian iron ore miner Fortescue on its clean energy ambitions from the last year of October, 1 year after his disastrous mini-budget crashed the pound. Is this news a sign that the Conservatives are heading for a defeat in the next election?
I think so, and I hope so as well. And I can just say that none of them will be missed, particularly this particular gentleman who, basically mortgage rates, the worst budget ever, dragged down the economy, dragged down the pound, etc., as you mentioned. And obviously, he has been doing a lot of media rounds, and then the Australian situation too. So I'm sure that he won't be suffering. He will merrily go off to perhaps Australia or somewhere else, and he won't be suffering any loss, particularly monetarily. But he leaves behind thousands of people in the UK who are suffering and will continue to suffer. And they're no loss whatsoever. He is no loss, and nor are the other MPs who are not standing again. And as soon as we get rid of this Tory government, although I'm not too sure about the incoming, if it is incoming, Labour government, because as far as I'm concerned, they're just red Tories also. So no matter who wins the next election, if it's, which I don't think the Tories will get in, and they see the writing on the wall, that's why they're all scrabbling away. I don't see any change in the UK if we have a Labour government as well. So I don't think it's looking good for us ordinary mortals, whoever gets in at the next election.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to the news that people are receiving the last cost of living payments on means-tested benefits today. A £299 cost of living payment, which will help more than 680,000 households in Scotland and more than 400,000 in Wales and 300,000 in Northern Ireland on means-tested benefits, will go directly into people's bank accounts between now and the 22nd of February. Without the need to apply, the payment is the last of the 3 instalments that totalled £900 and is part of the UK government's cost of living support package. The payments were introduced in 2022 when the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced a payment of £650 in 2 instalments in May. In November of that year, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, increased this to £900 across the 3 payments. The UK government has no current plans to extend the scheme, but charities have urged it to announce fresh support. While the inflation rate has eased from its previous double-digit high, it rose again to 4% in December, in the first increase for 10 months. The cost of household gas and electricity remains high as a result of the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022, and rents and mortgages have spiralled following the Liz Truss disastrous mini-budget. Morgan Wild, the Interim Director of Policy at Citizens Advice, said, "Increasingly, people come to Citizens Advice are living on empty. unable to afford their essential costs and finding themselves in a desperate situation. Citizens' advice data shows that the cost of living payments offers some respite to people, but it is short-lived, while historically high energy bills, unaffordable housing and other spiralling costs are keeping people in crisis. The UK government responded with temporary support, but there is a need for more than quick fixes. Long-term commitments are needed to raise people's income and standard of living, according to Citizens Advice Bureau. In November, a report by the Cross-Party Commons Work and Pensions Committee concluded that the cost of living payments, while welcomed, have not been sufficient to address the scale of the problem and offered only a short-term reprieve for many people struggling with high inflation and bills. Is the support the government given enough?
No, Sheldon, it's not, and I completely agree with the Citizen Advice Bureau. They're absolutely quite right. And you know, the rich are getting richer and people are getting poorer. Ordinary people are getting poorer. Mentioned the fact about oil and gas, prices caused by, Russia-Ukraine war. You know, when you look at other countries in Europe, Spain, France, other countries, their utility costs haven't went up the same as utility costs here. So basically, there's something wrong somewhere, and the way to fix this would have been to tax the rich more and to put tax on the energy companies to lower the price rather than giving people a pittance of a handout. I mean, I know people that go, in fact, I was talking to someone today who go into these wee cafes where they're social cafes and you can get a plate of soup for £1. They go in there with their appliances. Well, one lady had one of these motorised wheelchairs. Go in there and they charge them up in these cafes to sit there with a plate of soup and maybe a cup of coffee, which is thankfully subsidised, and they charge them up there and the cafes let them do it, even though they've got to pay that extra money for the electricity costs. What kind of country has this become when people are frightened to turn on their heating, elderly people, and I think we're going to go into something else regarding that as well to discuss it, but it's not enough. That was there to tax the rich and to put on monies onto energy companies to lower the costs. I mean, you look at other countries in Europe, Spain, France, other countries, their utility bills, their electricity, gas, has not went up the same as we have. And it's an absolute disgrace and a scandal when people, and it's cold tonight, and it's been cold and raining and snowing as well. Apparently we're going to get that again. People are going to die. That's the absolute. People are going to die of hypothermia. And they think of poor wee kids coming in from school. How are they going to do their homework or even get a hot meal when people can't afford to cook it or heat up the house? It's a disgrace, and it shouldn't be happening in this day and age.
Thank you. We're now going to return to Westminster. Motherwell and Wishaw MP presents a bill at the Westminster calling for social energy tariffs. Marion Fellows, the MP for Motherwell and Wishaw, has presented a bill in the UK Parliament today, which, if passed, would bring in a social tariff on energy bills to support disabled people with the additional cost of running and charging their medical equipment. Marion Fellows called on the UK government to support her bill. Figures released at the end of last year showed that over half, 56% of people from vulnerable households are worried about being cold this winter. This rises to 63% among people living in a household where someone is suffering from a pre-existing health condition or disabled. SNP MP Marion Fellows is a long-time supporter of Warm This Winter campaign, which aims to raise awareness of the skyrocketing costs of energy and the extra burden it placed upon disabled people to power essential life-saving equipment. The SNP has been calling on the UK government to implement a social tariff to support disabled people through the cost of living crisis, alongside the reintroduction of the £400 energy bill rebate. Commenting, Marion Fellows said, Westminster's cost of living crisis has been seen millions of households across Scotland face higher mortgage payments, energy bills and food costs, and it has been disproportionately impacting households with disabled people. It is unfair that households with disabled people who rely on life-saving electrical equipment are facing higher than average costs or having to choose between heating or charging equipment. They should not have to pay the price for this Tory government's economic incompetence. I am urging the UK government to support my bill and urgently implement a social energy tariff to financially support disabled people. Scotland is an energy-rich country with natural resources in abundance, but Westminster is holding us back by raking in the profits of our resources have generated, and by refusing to devolve energy powers. No household in Scotland should be facing fuel poverty. The cruel austerity agenda put in place by Westminster does not reflect the values and priorities of Scotland. The only way to ensure that Scotland's values are represented is through voting SNP to send a strong team of MPs to Parliament at the next general election. Sandra, after hearing the impact that the cost of living is having on disabled people, how does it look that the Prime Minister decided to make a bet with Piers Morgan for £1,000?
Yeah, absolutely horrifying, basically. Disgraceful and horrifying. I know he's been reported to the Standards Committee in the House of Commons. Imagine, putting a bet on, well, obviously it was on the refugees, Uganda, and that, but imagine putting a bet on and treating it so flippantly. That's the point. Treating it so flippantly as if you're in a horse race and betting on a horse. This government isn't fit to govern, and we know why. I mean, nobody elected Rishi Sunak, nobody elected Liz Truss. They're just appointed by the Tories, who have caused this ridiculous situation that people are living through. But when it comes to the social tariff, Marion Fellows has fought very hard on this particular issue, and on the post office issue as well, to be fair to her, has been doing it for many, many years. But she's absolutely spot on in regards to the fact that Scotland is an energy-rich country, and we produce more from renewables than anywhere else in the UK. And yet we've got to pay to get on the national grid, which is a disgrace. I mean, you look at the standing charges you're paying, which should be absolutely scrapped. Standing charges people are paying, even if you don't use your energy, you're still paying these standing charges every time, every day, week, month. So that should be scrapped completely. But yeah, we should have the powers, and that's where the big problem is. We don't have the powers over energy. And if Scotland had the powers over energy, independence would be even better, because we would have the powers then. We could do something about it. We should have our own national grid. We shouldn't have to pay to go on a national grid. Scotland is getting ripped off completely all the time. And if we don't get on to getting independence, we won't get these powers, and we'll be ripped off even more, and people will suffer even more. I did mention the lady that I spoke to today. Now imagine you've got one of these electric wheelchairs, and you've got to go to a wee cafe and charge it up because you can't afford to charge it up in your home. And that's just one example. What about other examples that's there? It's an absolute disgrace, as I said before, that people, who need life-saving equipment. Can you imagine? It's like a third world country. A life-saving equipment, and you're paying all that money. It's just unbelievable. And a point a lot of people don't pick up on either is the fact that hospitals and schools as well, community centres where people go, all have to pay this extra charge for utilities. So it's costing out of the budget from schools and hospitals the extra charge that they're paying. Now, you've got life-saving equipment in a hospital that needs electricity to keep it going, but you're having to pay that extra money. It's unbelievable that this lot are still in power. And unfortunately, I don't think Labour will change it either. So good on Marion, and I hope that they do something. But as I said previously, I very much doubt it, because they don't care. They know they're on their way out, and they're going to make sure people suffer even more than they're suffering already.
Okay, we're now going to turn to the cost of living crisis that seeing poor January retail sales in the UK. The traditional January sales on the high street failed to inspire a revival in consumer spending last month. As households continued to cut back amid the cost of living crisis, the UK's largest retailers said sales growth slowed last month as higher cost of living weighed heavily on the consumers, while weather conditions and strikes on the transport network in England also hit spending. Total sales rose by 1.2% in January compared with a year earlier, below with the annual average growth rate of 3.4% according to the British Retail Consortium, BRC. Much of the rise was the result of inflation driving up the value of goods being sold, masking a drop in sales volumes and a collapsing the online spending. The latest snapshot follows a disappointing Christmas for retailers after official figures showed a 3.2% monthly decline in December, marking the sharpest plunge since shops were forced to close during the COVID pandemic in 2021, confirming a lackluster start to 2024 as households continue to face sustained pressure on living costs. Separate figures from Barclays showed consumer card spending grew 3.1% year on year in January, below the current headline rate of inflation of 4%. Barclays said its survey of consumers' confidence pointed to an improving optimism, with the confidence in household finances and the ability to spend hitting the highest level for more than 2 years. However, BRC said the increasing confidence was yet to convert into strong levels of consumer spending. What would an independent Scotland do differently to grow the economy?
Well, basically, we have to look at all the problems that's happening. And I said, tax the rich. I bet the CEOs of Barclays banks and other institutions are not struggling. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, basically. And people who weren't poor, I always class the working poor as well, because they're working, they've not got a great wage, basically. But these CEOs, they're making thousands. Look at the banks, £500,000 bonuses, etc., etc. There should be a cap on that, but obviously they've said they won't cap it, and Labour have come out and said they won't cap that either. So you really need to start to look at wage. Fortunately in Scotland, salary-wise, we pay more for various jobs than they do in the rest of UK. The living wage, more than they do in the rest of the UK. That's something we need to start on with. If we had the powers of more than that, we could do something about it. But, we need to start looking at this. As I said, the percentage of people who are richer is greater than it's ever been, and the percentage of people who are getting poorer is greater. So there's this big, vast gap, and we need to look at that gap. We should be putting, taxes on bankers' bonuses and the CEOs, rather than arguing about people who are working in care homes or even doctors and nurses, which obviously in Scotland it's entirely different from the rest of the UK. And that's something I think we could look at, and we could bring down the cost of living for people, but we don't have the powers over that. Mortgage-wise as well, for young people to get on the mortgage ladder, it's impossible practically. And it's not just getting a mortgage and the cost of the mortgage, it's getting the deposit percentage off to get that. Now, how can you do that if you can't even save? So for me, I know it sounds tax the rich, but it's not just tax the rich, it's tax the super rich. Put caps on these bonuses, these bankers' bonuses, basically caps on other, CEOs, etc., etc. Far too much money is going into the hand of a very small pocket of people. And, the Tories, through the COVID situation and the supply of goods and where it went, Michelle Moan and others, let's get them to pay it back, rather than all the money's, you're talking billions of pounds here that's
Yeah,
wasted.
we're now going to turn to Civil Servants Union, who have said that ministerial code is completely inadequate. Trade union leaders representing civil servants have told the Commons Standards Committee that no civil servant who went through the complaints process against the former Justice Secretary Dominic Raab would ever want to go through it again. Such was the ordeal. The MPs on the committee heard that there was zero confidence in the process of raising complaints about ministers, and the ministerial code was completely inadequate. Dave Penman of the FDA and Mike Clancy from Prospect told the committee that the party leaders were failing to get their house in order when it came to protecting employees from the behaviour of MPs and excluding accused figures from the parliamentary estate. Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, later told the committee that MPs had complained that the threshold for triggering a recall petition was too low. Under current legislations, any MP who's suspended from the Commons for 10 days or more can be subject to a recall petition, which triggers a by-election if it is signed by 10% of the MP's constituents. Mordaunt said several MPs had complained to her that the 10-day threshold meant there were no middle options for censuring misbehaving MPs short of them potentially losing their seats. Earlier, Penman told the committee that the ministerial code was completely and utterly inadequate for the purpose of regulating conduct amongst ministers and servants, citing the cases of prime ministers who he said had refused to sanction investigations against political allies or even acknowledge evidence. There is one individual who decides whether there will be an investigation and what the outcome of that investigation will be, and there is zero confidence in the process of raising complaints. Ask anyone involved in the recent high-profile complaints against the former Justice Minister, and they will say they will never go through the process again, he said. In their written evidence to the committee, the trade unions said that they had been pressing over the past 2 years for Parliament to adopt a formal mechanism by which MPs arrested on suspicion of sexual or violent offences would be prevented from accessing the parliamentary estate from undertaking parliamentary-funded travel. Is it time the ministerial code was legislated for in Parliament?
Absolutely, Sheldon. I agree with the trade unions there. Basically, these MPs who have been accused can still come into the House of Commons, can still do their so-called work, if they do any, some of them anyway, still do their so-called work, still get paid. Even if they don't come in, they can still get paid, and no sanctions against them at all. In regard to travel, that's just one thing, but they can still go ahead with their so-called job whilst they're supposedly under investigation. So I think the trade unions have got a very, very strong point there. There's lots of things that need to be changed in Westminster. It really doesn't satisfy not just the trade unions, the workers, but the general public as well, because they're held to a different law than the MPs are. And who makes the law? The MPs. You're making a law for yourself. Conflict of interest completely right there as well. And the 10%, of electorate that you put in the petition, etc., that's ancient stuff, isn't it? To have to go around and get 10% of the electorate to sign up. And lots of people either won't bother or don't have the time or whatever it may be. The whole thing needs to be looked at. I entirely agree with the trade unions. And once they start on that, let's have them looking at some of the other strange laws that are in Westminster or perhaps not in and should be in Westminster as well.
Thank you very much. Turning to the Conservatives, Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg launched new right-wing populist Conservative group. At the Popular Conservatism Group launch event in London, the ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss said that Britons want to see lower immigration and want illegal migrants deported, and that Conservatives have not taken on the left-wing extremists. Truss said that for 2 decades the Tories had tried to appease these people and argued that ministers have the responsibility without having power because of the institutions having greater sway. Rees-Mogg declared that the age of Davos man is over, and Truss urged her colleagues to stop worrying about getting a job in Sunak's government and take the fight to the left-wing extremists running UK's institutions instead. Of the 4 MPs billed to speak, just two were present, Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg. The former Cabinet Minister, Ranil Jayawardena, regarded by some as a rising star of the Tory right, pulled out on Monday with a swipe at his fellow panellists, and Simon Clarke, another Trustite, former Cabinet Minister, was removed from the lineup by the organisers 2 weeks ago after calling for Rishi Sunak to be ousted. The launch of this new right-wing group highlights the growing splits in the Conservative Party in an election year, when they are already far behind Labour in the polls in England. With so many different groups, does the Conservatives have an identity crisis?
Conservatives have had an identity crisis for many, many years. And let's just look at how we got into this situation. And I don't know why they don't just call themselves Britain First rather than this strange conglomerate PLG or whatever it is. Basically, this Conservative, the whole reason we've got Brexit and various other things was because of Cameron and terrified of this right-wing group within the Conservatives. And that's where it's all started from. Instead of having, their own issues, as they thought, they become this populist thing. And you had Nigel Farage, who came up, who was just a simple racist, and he came forward with this. And then instead of them and Labour, but Conservatives we're talking about just now, bringing forward their policies, they thought, well, I have to go even further right-wing than Nigel Farage, and spoke about immigration, as you've mentioned. They've just become a pure right-wing, and I'll use the word fascist. I don't care, I'll use the word fascist, because that is what they have become. And this is where we're in this position we are at the moment, because the fascists, the right-wings, and Nigel Farage, and you just need to look at the two names that was mentioned there who are in this group. It's frightening, absolutely frightening, that they think this is what the British public want. It's not what the British public wants, certainly not what Scotland wants anyway. We welcome people to come into our country, but there are certain aspects down south which they are playing to the populist vote. And I don't see why they don't just call themselves the National Front or whatever it may be. And perhaps Nigel Farage will join them right enough, and he will put himself forward as an MP and basically as the next Prime Minister, because that seems to be the way the Conservatives are going. But they've had this problem for many, many years, and we've ended up with this government as we've got just now, and have caused Brexit and the situation that we're in now, the cost of living and everything else, all because the Conservatives argue amongst themselves, and that's the way it'll continue unless they get, knocked out of office, which I think they will. I hope they will anyway, but as I said, I don't see much hope further on for the Labour Party, because they're just completely copying whatever the Conservatives do and trying to outdo them, being more right-wing than the Conservatives are. And that's why we're here just now, where we are. And I'd just say good riddance to all of them, because none of them have done anything for the UK as a whole, and certainly not for Scotland anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to turn to America. Court rules Trump is not immune from prosecution in 2020 election interference case. A federal appeals court panel has rejected Donald Trump's arguments that he cannot be criminally prosecuted for his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results because it involved actions he took while president. Last year, Trump filed a motion to dismiss the federal indictment brought by the special counsel Jack Smith, which charged the former president over his efforts to reverse the 2020 elections, including by advancing fake states of electors and obstructing Congress on 6th of January 2021. The motion was rejected by the trial judge, prompting Trump to appeal to the D.C. Circuit. The special counsel sought to bypass the potential lengthy appeals process by asking the U.S. Supreme Court to intervene directly, but the nation's highest court returned to the case to the appeals court. While hearing oral arguments in Washington, D.C. on the 9th of January, the three-judge panel at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit had expressed skepticism with Trump's claims to immunity, while the ex-president looked on in the courtroom, and today they rejected his claims. The very legal process itself is acting as a hindrance to the prosecution in the federal criminal case and playing into Trump's hands. Before today's decision, it was thought that the long-shot ruling in Trump's favor would be a significant blow to Smith. However, the ruling that Trump is not immune will most likely mean him appealing to the full DC Circuit and then potentially the US Supreme Court, causing delays to the progress of the case during the 2024 Republican primaries and thrusting the Supreme Court into the middle of the presidential elections. Trump is facing 91 charges in 4 separate criminal cases, 2 federal, 1 in New York and 1 in Georgia. Sandra, if Trump is convicted of if he is convicted of trying to prevent the election being held in a fair way, how will that impact this election in America?
It will have a very big impact. I mean, you look at the news and you'll see that, unfortunately, Trump is still popular in America, and Biden's popularity is dipping in certain states. He's already won. Was it Iowa, I think it was? He's already won there, basically. So it'll have great implications. But, you know, I've great respect for the American people. Seems I've got great respect for some of the UK people as well. But I just look at Trump and then all I ever see is Boris Johnson. You know, they're very similar. The difference with America is that he has been taken to court, the Supreme Court, whereas here in the UK, Boris Johnson's got away with everything, you know, basically, which was against parliamentary law. He's got away with it. Nobody's ever took him to court. But I think it will have a great effect, because if this is running towards the primaries and the elections, then it dependent on the media, how they cover it. There'll be some media who will ignore it completely because they support Trump. On the other hand, there'll be some, not a lot, but there'll be some of the media who will mention this court case, and it could have a detrimental effect on Trump. But the way things are in America, it seems to be that Trump is still riding on a wave that could get him elected regardless of this. It's coming out, you know, the charges. I mean, goodness sake, 91 charges, that's huge, isn't it? For anybody to go through. And you would imagine in a democracy, supposedly, that this would stop anyone from even being put forward as a presidential candidate. But it doesn't seem to be. But if it's done properly, and the Supreme Court continues on, and it is raised at every, you know, primary, then basically it could do damage to Trump. But then Biden is past his time as well. Really, they need somebody else, not just Biden and Trump. There needs to be somebody else, which we know that somebody else will come in. But whether they take any votes away from Trump, I just don't know. But it will have an effect. It definitely will have an effect.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Holyrood. Scott Gov pilots a national hub to support women out of prostitution. A national hub is to be created to support women out of prostitution. A pilot of the hub will begin in summer, followed by a phased national rollout. The hub will bring together specialist services which support women affected by commercial sexual exploitation, linking them more closely with local mainstream services, such as housing, health and social security. The National Hub is a part of a new strategy to support women to safely exit from prostitution and challenge men's demand for prostitution. The strategy also includes actions taken to tackle stigma for those with experience of prostitution and challenge the normalisation of men purchasing sex. The hub will be rolled out in a phased approach across the following areas: Edinburgh and the Borders, Highland, Perth, Kinross and Aberdeen and Dundee, Glasgow and Ayrshire. Yeah. So, what do you think? Is this a good policy?
Absolutely, and we already had a policy in place for many, many years. It was called TARA, and it was based in Glasgow, who helped women get out of prostitution, similar to what you're saying just now. But this seems to be more joined up, particularly with the social security situation. But Tara was one of the places where people could go, they could get advice, particularly in housing, how to routes out of prostitution was another one. Basically, so they've amalgamated, I presume, Tara and routes out of prostitution and came up with this overall one. And I think it's a very, very good thing. As someone who's fought for years and years and years to try and get something like this, routes out of prostitution, I wish it well, and I'm sure it will be a very good success.
Thank you very much. Well, that is it for this evening. Before I go, I want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland, we are depending on the generosity of our supports. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programme will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are still £1,500 short of the £10,000 target. Although the pressure has been eased, we still need to raise the £1,500 to pay our bills immediately. So can we then focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscribers base and regular funding? Thank you again to our guests and Sandra, and goodbye, and thank you for watching.